It's really a pleasure for me to moderate this very interesting session. And we have a fantastic panel of speakers today. So the first one that I would invite to speak is Yasin Jibo, that is the Executive Director of Speak Up Africa. And so Yasin, thank you so much. If you can start with your presentation. While we wait for Yasin, let me just tell to the audience that there will be a question and answer session, and you will find a button on the top right of your screen. So when you will see questions, you can open that button and reply to that. That will be one way for improving the discussion of today. So seeing the technical problems, I would pass the floor to Dr. Brian Tarimo, that is a research scientist at the Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania. So Brian, thank you so much for being with us today. Please have the floor.
Thank you, Piero. More than half of the world's population is at risk of contracting vector-borne diseases each year. Vector-borne diseases are responsible for a great deal of morbidity and mortality, accounting for more than 17% of all infectious diseases and causing more than 700 deaths annually. With regards to malaria, according to the 2020 World Malaria Report, there were almost 229 million cases of malaria in 2019. Out of these cases, 409,000 resulted in deaths, with most of them being children under the age of 5 years. Furthermore, this report also highlighted that the reduction in malaria cases has stalled in many parts of the world, with some countries reporting an increase. It is evident that the current interventions used to control malaria mosquitoes have reached the limit of their efficacy. Therefore, we cannot proceed with business as usual approach by employing the same resources and interventions and expect the target set to reduce malaria and eventual elimination and eradication of the disease to be met. The development of novel and complementary intervention is required in order to achieve further gains and not to lose any ground. One such novel intervention is the use of genetically modified mosquitoes with gene drives known as gene-drive mosquitoes. These are the mosquitoes with a genetic modification that either impairs their ability to reproduce and thus over time aims at eliminating the mosquito from the population. This is known as population suppression, or impairs the ability to transmit malaria parasites and thus over time aims at the permanent introduction of new mosquito into the population. This is known as population replacement. Now, the genetic modification in these mosquitoes is coupled with a super Mendelian form of inheritance known as gene drive that biases inheritance from one generation to another, such that instead of a 50-50 chance of genetic modification to be passed from parent to offspring, there is now a near 100% chance of the genetic modification to be passed from parents and offspring. Gene-drive mosquitoes offer a novel and a uniquely transformative way of fighting against malaria. It is time to pull behind our scientists and support their work, and we should be that generation that ensures that we can get rid of malaria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Very interesting. Indeed, an incredibly stimulating novel tool for dealing with such a huge threat. So I think that the organizers just informed you that the question and answer session should now work. So I hope you find a button for the questions on your screen. In case there is any problem with that, Brian, just a question. You know, there is also some concern on the use of these novel tools. Who should decide, in your opinion, who should be the authority or the stakeholders that should take a decision on the use of novel tools such as gene-drive mosquitoes for controlling malaria?
I think more important than it is to ensure that the right frameworks and guidelines are in place to ensure that such research and such tools can be adopted. So instead of deciding who should be responsible, we should focus our time to ensure that there is the right frameworks and guidelines for carrying out such research. We should ensure that there is the right procedures for biosafety evaluation. We should ensure that there's enough capacity building, so we have enough personnel in indigenous countries to ensure they understand the technology and the infrastructure to do such technology. And also, we should also have effective community engagement that the recipients of this technology should understand the technology. They should be involved from the beginning in the planning and its implementation phases.
Thank you very much, Brian. You gave a very comprehensive reply to that, and we hope to have Yassine soon with us, because the role of local communities is indeed essential for dealing with these tools. But there is one aspect that is definitely very important for the future, and is the assessment of the possible ecological effects of these new tools. So I'm very happy to have with us Dr. Talia Hackett, that is a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford University in the United Kingdom. And so Talia, please let us know the studies you plan to do on this issue.
So thank you, Piero, for that introduction, and Brian for the really nice description of kind of gene drive and why it's important. So as Brian kind of alluded to, gene drive will actually target a specific mosquito species. But before that's really acceptable, we need to understand what it's doing ecologically in its environment. So to understand that, you need to know a little bit about the biology of a mosquito, which is it has a larval stage that is aquatic. And then when it emerges from the water, it will visit flowers and nectar sources in order to get sugar. When it mates, the females then need to take a blood meal, and that's how they develop their eggs. So you have interactions that are happening with other animals in the water around pollination or potential pollination, and also in the air and in the terrestrial environment. So those are all different places where you could see ecological interactions and ecological impacts if you start to reduce the numbers of a species. So the way that we're doing this is actually to collect the data using DNA. And what you do is you create a big barcode library of all of the insects that are in the area, and then you look into the guts or the feces of animals that might be eating mosquitoes, but also might be eating other animals and other insects. Once you have all of this data, both in the aquatic environment and in the terrestrial environment, you can put it together into what's called an ecological network or a food web. So this is very much like a food chain where something eats something, except much more complicated and much bigger. So once you have all of these interactions that are found by actually kind of looking into the guts and feces and finding a specific link, and you have this interaction network or food web, you can then start to model what would happen if a species was removed. And you can watch that kind of cascade as, say, something like a bat or a dragonfly is eating this specific mosquito species, Anopheles gambiae is a good example. What might it then have to shift its diet towards in order to make up for the lost biomass that it had? And what is that species doing relative to the rest of the environment? So this way you can start to predict what the actual cascading consequences might be. Now, having said that, it's very common that there's fluctuation in any kind of ecosystem. And this fluctuation tends to let communities of species that are interaction actually rewire. So if you were to remove one species, things too tend to kind of rewire back to pick up their lost biomass. So because of that, and because there's no real known specialist predator of a mosquito, and no known direct pollination interaction between Anopheles gambiae and any one specific flower, or no real evidence that Anopheles gambiae is an important pollinator, we don't expect that this is the case. But we are looking, and we're doing large-scale experiments in Ghana. I'm working with a large team of researchers in Ghana who are collecting this data in order to create these networks so that we can actually determine what these cascading effects will be.
Thank you very much. Very nice to see that Yasin Jibo is with us now. But I would ask the organizers to launch now the poll so that we can have a few questions. And I will ask then the panelists, the speakers, to try to answer to the questions and to the positions that will come out from the audience. So you are all invited to respond to these questions, and this is just a way for us to have a more helpful discussion. So you are reading on the screen, how many additional malaria-caused deaths could climate change lead to annually between 2030 and 2050, in your opinion? So these are a few figures that you can see on your screen, and thank you for answering to that. This is quite an important question. As Brian said on the beginning, malaria is, before the COVID pandemic, was by far the first cause of mortality in most areas of the world. So do we expect an increase in the future due to climate change? Let's see if we manage to have a poll, and if we can see the results of the poll. I think there is a okay. So far, we have half of the audience that is voting, that is thinking that we could have 34,000 more deaths in the future, and half of the audience thinking that this number could raise to 60,000. So Brian, what is your opinion on this question? What can you say on this?
So I think option 4, 60,000 leans more towards the correct answer. Climate change significantly will shift the weight balance in favor of the mosquitoes and malaria transmission. Therefore, I am leaning towards the 60,000 additional more cases.
Thank you. Okay, so I would suggest to pass now the floor to our speaker, Yasin Jibo. Yasin is with the organization Speak Up Africa. So as it was said on the beginning, there is the essential importance in involving the local communities. So I think this is an area of work that is extremely important. And Yasin, please tell us something about this aspect of the use of gene drive vectors for controlling malaria.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you all. Greetings to all my fellow panelists and participants. Speak Up Africa is a policy and advocacy action tank dedicated to catalyzing leadership, enabling policy change, and increasing awareness for sustainable development in Africa. And we've been working for many years now in the fight against malaria. And really what we've seen overall is that, according to WHO, currently there are 3.9 billion people that are at risk to getting infected by vector-borne diseases, and 700,000 are dying every year from these diseases. And malaria alone kills 400,000 people, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, and it affects disproportionately children under 5. What we also see is that malaria infection during pregnancy can have very adverse effects on both mothers and the fetus, including maternal anemia and premature delivery. However, beyond the terrible death toll that we see from these diseases, they also represent a high economic toll on the countries that are affected, and malaria alone represents a loss of $12 billion per year in sub-Saharan Africa, and dengue represents a cost of $3 billion for Latin American countries. And as we know, malaria is particularly climate sensitive, significantly influenced by changes in temperature, as well as the frequency and severity of extreme weather events such as cyclones. And what we really, at a community level, see, and what is increasingly important, is that, as Africa is particularly vulnerable to both climate change and malaria, because we represent such a high burden of the malaria burden, it's really critical for civil society organizations and community ownership and leadership. Community voices, including the youth and the next generation, are critical, and community actions need to be celebrated and amplified at local, regional, and global levels. And we really need to make sure we understand the behavioral changes, the religious context, the individual relationships with these diseases, as well as those living and working in these local communities who can best advocate for them. And for us, we've been working on many campaigns which really put forth the role of each and everyone's ownership when it comes to eliminating malaria. And we've launched a campaign called Zero Malaria Starts With Me, which really seeks to bring together society-wide movement to help countries get back on track in terms of where we are with respect to the malaria cases, and really being able to build on the efforts that have been made to date, as we've seen with the 7.6 million lives that have been saved since 2000. When it comes to new technologies and innovation, it is critical to really be able to address these vector-borne diseases and other global health challenges. We believe that malaria eradication will only be achieved if we're able to invest in research development and be able to ensure that prioritization of new tools by everybody. But equally important is to ensure that the stakeholders in the countries are really meaningfully engaged in the process, and that we're doing so from the onset. And specific to African scientists, we really encourage, all of us to really work hand in hand with them so that they're involved at all the stages of the development process, but also lead on field research, as well as engagement both with regulators and with communities. For communities to really be able to build trust, earn that confidence, there needs to be also transparency in the information and the data that is shared with them regarding these new technologies. And so for us at Speak Up Africa, it's really critical to ensure that civil society communities are participating in the elimination fight when it comes to malaria, but also taking into consideration all of these key elements associated with climate change, and ensuring that they have all of the information that they need, knowing that malaria parasites really need less time to develop at lower temperatures than we thought. We know that even slightly warming temperatures may be enough to heighten the malaria risk, and that we really need to make sure that we understand the impact of malaria transmission, especially due to extreme weather events, and that over the long term, we're able to take into account those factors, especially as we just saw with the numbers. By 2050, climate change alone might expose some areas in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and China to a 15% higher probability of malaria transmission. So we see how important it is to really ensure that we have that dialogue on how to grapple with the interlinked challenges of climate change and malaria elimination, and subsequently be able to identify strategies and opportunities to be able to mitigate that impact, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable populations.
Thank you so much, Yassine. This is really a very helpful discussion, because I think the involvement of stakeholders and local community will be crucial. And as you said, it is important to build trust between science, decision makers, and local communities. What is your impression in general? Is there, because, for example, in Europe, there is often quite some concern in the society in the use of new technologies for controlling wild species, and the genetic techniques sometimes raise more concerns than other techniques. How is it the situation, in your opinion, in the communities in Africa, for example. Is there a concern on the current methods for controlling malaria, for example, the use of insecticides and so on? And is there enough trust on science for supporting the use of novel techniques such as gene drives?
Question. I mean, certainly it's something that is we really need to ensure that the communities have the information and the knowledge that they need, especially when introducing new technologies such as gene drive, where it is new, and for most of the people in the communities, they don't always fully understand why we're introducing these new technologies, what the impact to them will be, and how it will affect their future and the future of their children. So it's critical, as it is across the world, to really ensure that we're working with leading scientists and researchers and being able to transform the knowledge we have in a language that is understood by the communities so that they're able to associate the overall impact of the intervention with their day-to-day lives, knowing that for many of us, myself included, this is fairly new, and even though we understand how important it is, there is that need to really invest in that stakeholder engagement, invest in that local capacity, partnerships, and really co-create the solutions and the approach that needs to be put in place in each country based on the particular environment within that country.
Thank you so much. I think this is definitely an essential approach for the future work on this issue. Brian, let me ask you another question again on the malaria, on the current methods for controlling malaria. We all know that there is a problem of resistance to insecticides that is limiting the efficacy of the methods that are now available in the many countries that are affected by malaria. If I remember correctly, there are 81 countries that are considered malaria endemic. How many of these reported cases of resistance to the most commonly used insecticide in latest year? How wide is this problem of raising resistance to insecticide by mosquitoes?
Thank you, Piero. So out of the 81 malaria endemic country, in 2019, 73 of these countries reported having at least resistance to one of the 4 insecticide classes that are currently being used. And this is an increase of 26 countries from the report that came out the previous year in 2018 that documented that reported about insecticide resistance from 2010 to 2017. So the issue of insecticide resistance in the context of malaria control is a very enormous one, and one that could easily be circumvented with use of gene-drive mosquitoes. As we know that, furthermore, insecticide resistance or insecticides, they are broad in the sense that they tend to target more than just malaria-transmitting mosquitoes. Here with gene-drive mosquitoes, we are suggesting or trying to use something that is specific, that will help you target what the mosquitoes that transmits malaria, specifically the mosquito that transmits malaria.
Now, this is indeed, you showed that this is a huge problem. So this is going to limit quite largely the efficacy of the current methods for controlling a disease that is having such a huge impact on so many communities. But Charlie, I have a couple of questions for you, because when we talk about malaria, of course, the key issue that usually is addressed is the what are the potential effects in terms of health. But there is also another aspect that are the ecological effects of these new methods, as you that is the topic that you're going to study in the next future. I have the first question I would pose you is, in your opinion, considering the existing methods that we have for controlling vectors, in the past, for example, in my country, we used landscape management, drying wetlands for controlling mosquitoes and malaria. And then we started using insecticides. This is the technique that was used for eradicating the malaria from Sardinia, for example, in Italy. Do you expect to have the gene drive could have higher or lower ecological impacts? And the second question that is related to this one is, how is our ability to predict the undesired effects? So do we know enough of this new tool for being reasonably sure of the future effects, undesired effects of this new tool? So thank you very much if you can give us your opinions on these two questions.
So starting with the first one, of course, anytime you do particularly wetland management or any kind of habitat modification, of course, you're affecting the community of species that rely on that habitat. And there's lots of studies globally, and it's a very hot topic now, about how climate change, but also habitat loss, is really affecting insect species and causing these sort of large-scale population declines. So absolutely, modifying the landscape will have an impact, not just on the mosquito, but on a whole community of animals. Equally, the insecticides that we use, they're very powerful. They've had a really important role in driving down the numbers of malaria, but they're not species specific. So pyrethroids, which is the common family of insecticides that are used for insecticide treated bed nets, while they're very good currently against Anopheles gambiae mosquitoes, and as Brian talked about, there's issues with insecticide resistance, but they also are very good at taking out a lot of other species. So again, this will have an impact on the community of insects and then the species that rely on them for food. The benefit of gene drive, which would work alongside insecticides, is that it can target just the species that you want, so just the Anopheles gambiae species. And there's quite a lot of research going on about the gene flow, so how much mating there is kind of outside of the malaria mosquitoes. And it seems like there's really not any gene flow outside of the target species, this complex of malaria transmitting mosquitoes. So you can really get at just the one target that you're aiming for, which in some ways is both more desirable, but also much easier to predict. It's quite difficult to start predicting at a large scale, just because ecology is incredibly complex. Everything interacts and with lots of other species, but also there's dynamics, there's time dynamics and also space dynamics built in there. And doing that for large communities and actually predicting kind of what happens when habitats are lost, it's possible, but it carries a lot more uncertainty. Whereas predicting what happens with just one species loss is much, much easier to predict. So in terms of kind of using these food webs that I talked about at the beginning, to predict it, you have these very quantifiable links to all of the species that are interacting. And you can follow that. The broader you want to take it, the harder it is to predict. But it's much more tractable with one species loss or a handful of species loss than it is for losing large-scale habitats or trying to apply insecticide loss across a range of species of insects, for instance.
Talia, just another small question. Do you think there is a risk that when, in case the vector is successfully removed, another vector could replace it with even worse effects, or is this a very limited risk? Do we know enough of the communities for thinking that the removal of one vector could cause impacts that so far we haven't recorded?
So this is again something that we're looking at in the in the adult food web. There's not much chance of any competition because there's no limit to blood meals, and there's not really a limit of nectar in most places. So it's most likely, if you have competition, it's most likely to be happening in the aquatic habitat. And we are actually collecting data on species that are together and doing sort of laboratory experiments to see if there's any competition between different species of mosquitoes. Having said that, there's not really another mosquito that is worse for us. So Anopheles gambiae really is our mosquito. It's where you have humans, you tend to have Anopheles gambiae. And where you have Anopheles gambiae, they tend to be biting humans, and you often have malaria as a result. So there's not likely to be a worse mosquito, but also the competitive release element from such a targeted approach isn't very likely, because Anopheles gambiae tends to breed in small ephemeral water bodies, which aren't particularly well suited for most other species of mosquito. So it's not terribly likely. Right. But we are also investigating that.
Right. No, I think that the points you made show, and I think we learned a lot, unfortunately, from the pandemic, is that we need to invest much more in research and development that we've done so far in all new tools, because that's something we learned. But I think research is not enough. I hope we will have time for another question to Brian on this. But first, I would like to ask to Yassine something on the policy framework. Because, for example, in Europe, we are unfortunately experiencing the arrival of exotic vectors, such as the tiger mosquito, that has brought in our region over 20 between viruses and other diseases. What do you think is the key answer in terms of the policy response? How can we foster? What lessons do you think we could learn in Europe from other regions of the world in terms of what is needed for creating a more solid policy framework for dealing with new tools such as the gene drive?
Thank you for that question. I mean, of course, policy and frameworks are critical to be able to address some of these issues that we've been talking about, and specifically the global policy frameworks for climate change and biodiversity, as well as the European Green Deal, need to take this public threat into account and really be able to provide and coordinate a response and preparedness for potential future epidemics. So it's critical to really prioritize the policy response, and really looking at public health, climate change, and biodiversity cannot be addressed separately, as they have very clear interdependencies. For example, when you look at the European Union objectives to reduce the use of chemicals and pesticides, they need to take into account that insecticides are currently the main tool for vector-borne disease control. Therefore, there is really a need to accompany this process and to invest, as you mentioned, in the development and research for new tools.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, again, there are so many lessons we learned from the health issues that the need for strengthening and to discussing these aspects in the current time where we are discussing the future biodiversity framework and the Green Deal and so on is definitely essential. Brian, going back to how to be more prepared for those challenges in terms of scientific research and technology, and for example, also technology ownership, what do you think that Africa, about the work that is being done in Africa? Is it enough? Are there areas that there should be more efforts? So what do you think are the priorities for research and technology in Africa?
Thank you, Piero. With regards to science, technology, and research in Africa, I would very much emphasize on capacity development. With regards to what we've been talking about here with gene drive research, Africa stands to accrue the most from this technology. And therefore, African scientists and African leaders should be at the forefront, actually leading the discussion and trying to understand this technology. It should not be seen like it's one of what has happened in the past or what's been predicted to happen in the past. some form of maybe a parachute research. So in order to do that, us as African scientists and policymakers and the governments, we need to be at the forefront discussing about this technology. Oftentimes you tend to have leaders and African scientists and so forth trying to avoid these discussions, and they would take the approach of let this happen in other countries until it's proven there, then maybe we should adopt it. But if you take that approach, once this is the science backs up the technology and it's successful, you tend to do a catch-up game. So I think it's very important that the scientists and the leaders and policymakers in African countries to be fully engaged in this technology. This is by training local scientists to ensure that we have the local infrastructures to carry out such technologies, and also engage the community, as I said earlier, because they are the recipients of this technology, so they should be aware of it, understand it, and they can. And history has shown if community members are aware of the technology, it becomes easier in its implementation and rollout.
Excellent. This is indeed a very, very interesting view on this problem. I think that what is coming up from your talks and from my limited understanding of this new approach is that somehow we need to apply the One Health approach on this issue, as it has been called for other issues. So we need to understand that we need to have communities that are informed and engaged, to have a very rigorous assessment of the potential health risks, but at the same time to also understand better the ecological consequences of what we do. And I think that the work you plan to do, you're doing for involving and informing the communities is essential, and this is also, I think, a response to a concern that has been raised internationally. So we need to have an informed agreement by the local communities for using new tools. So Yassine, just I would ask you a final comment on this issue about the need to have a wider approach, a One Health approach that deals with the awareness and understanding of the communities, the science, but also at the same time the ecological aspects. What do you think is the policy arena? Are the decision makers aware of the need to have a different approach in the future on these issues?
So I think your question really is the right one to be posing today. There is a need for decision makers in countries to really be able to understand what we're doing and really look at it from a holistic approach. And looking at it purely from a regulatory and policy environment, we know how many challenges there are with respect to the regulatory environment, the lack of national biosafety authorities in the countries, some of the new concepts that are put in place that are not necessarily clearly defined, the regional coordination element. We really need to have mechanisms that we put in place at a regional level for coordination and authorizations, but also in country to really be able to have those stakeholders that are critical to these discussions around the same table. And of course, I fully concur with everything Brian just said around the need to really have scientists drive the agenda and really have local scientists drive the agenda and really be involved at all levels and be the owners of the introduction of these new technologies and the communication with the communities to be able to build that confidence and trust. So for us, it's really critical at the regional level, at the country level, and at the community level to ensure that there is an understanding of the new approaches being implemented, and to your point around the One Health approach, being able to ensure that our policymakers and are integrating all of these elements within their different work areas so that it's looked upon holistically and not in silos. And, you know, more and more, we're all talking about the importance of that multi-sectoral collaboration. And in this area, such as this one and in others, it's even more important to have that that collaboration and coordination across issue areas.
No, thank you so much. And my impression is that at the global scale, I know more the European context, but I think there is a general issue everywhere, is that we need to consider very seriously the concerns of people. And sometimes the concerns are not necessarily science-based, but it's important that the scientific community makes an effort for communicating better the results and the reliability of their work, because otherwise, if we don't get higher support from the society, any innovative tool risks to be unsuccessful. So I would thank you very much. I think it's been an excellent session, and I learned a lot. So I'm just the moderator. I'm not an expert on this specific issue, but I learned a lot from you. And let me pass over the floor to Angela Weiss from the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ. And thank you again for your inputs today. And thank you to all the people that attended this session. Angela.
Thank you very much, Piero, and thank you very much for this very informative lab debate. As the poll showed, a majority of our audience actually have been aware that climate change directly leads to an increased risk of malaria transmission and other vector-borne diseases. However, I think not everybody has been aware about the high number of people actually being affected. I noted that more than 3.9 billion people are at risk of vector-borne diseases, and more than 700,000 die every year. So it's clear research definitely plays a really crucial role here in order to identify complementary tools to already existing methods in order to be prepared and to fight these risks. However, we heard gene drive could be one of the solutions, but it's also a very bold proposal as it involves modifying species at large. This raises certainly many technical, scientific, but also ethical questions, such as should we modify nature to protect human health, or is it unacceptable to do so? So it's clear more research is required, and it's great that you guys, you are on it in order to answer all these different questions. And we also heard from our panel that it's very important to have a comprehensive approach in line with the One Health approach. We need to bring everybody on board, from public health, biodiversity, local communities, in order to foster research and to find really solutions to these threats. Thanks again to our panel for this really informative discussion. We will now continue here our program on Channel 4 on the topic of research, data and new technologies with our Global Stand interview on the program of Copernicus. So stay with us. We will be back in a few moments.